The subject of my talk is decomposing translation studies, and you've probably seen that I'm in charge of the the field called the state of translation studies today in the world. Now, this is, of course, a very daunting task. Translation studies today has become, I believe, a little bit of a monster. It's called now an interdiscipline, it's called a transdiscipline, it's called a polydiscipline. And I think it's very hard for, for any one researcher to actually know what goes on in his or her own linguistic and cultural fields, because I frankly don't know what goes on in a lot of the world. But I shall try to have a fairly general view on where I think translation studies is going, where translation is going, and perhaps try to point out where the dangers are for the future of translation studies. That's what I'm going to attempt to do in the few minutes that are going to come. Now, I'm going to begin by giving you two very simple definitions of translation and translation studies. And I'm going to do that because it's going to give me a chance not only to talk about the state of play today and perhaps the future state of play tomorrow, but it will give me a chance to come back at the end and to recap what we believe translation studies is now and what we may think it might be in the years to come. Now, I've taken two well-known definitions by two well-known researchers who write in English. The first is Jeremy Munday, and he writes, "Translation studies is the discipline which studies phenomena associated with translation in its many forms." This is, I think, is a very clever definition because it says in its many forms. Then I've taken Venuti's definition of translation, which goes as follows. Translation is a process by which the chain of signifiers that constitutes the source language text is replaced by a chain of signifiers in the target language, which the translator provides on the strength of an interpretation. Now, this, I think, is also a very interesting definition, and one which I shall most definitely come back to, because that is one, perhaps, where translation and translation studies is a little bit under threat. So what I will be attempting to do is not just to talk about the state of play as I see it today, but I'll be attempting to envisage how translation will probably change in the coming years. And as translation will probably change, it is my belief that translation studies must change in order to remain relevant. Just a very quick word about this title, which is not a translation of my title in French. It's a title that attempts to play on two ideas. It's, first of all, of course, the idea that I shall try to decompose what translation studies is today. But it also suggests this idea of threat, this idea of possible decomposition, which is perhaps there for us to think about in the years to come. Now, what I'm going to say is actually very simple. It's divided into four very simple parts. First, I'm going to talk about translation today. Then I'm going to talk about translation studies today. After that, I'm going to talk about translation tomorrow. And finally, I'm going to talk about translation studies tomorrow. And I shall, of course, reach a conclusion at the end. So, what is translation today? To understand translation today, I think it's very useful to take a leaf out of Jean-Yves Masson's book and just to look a tiny little bit into the past. If I look into the past, what seems to me to be true is that we, researchers today, we do have an idea, perhaps erroneous, but an idea at least of what translation was. What translation was, it seems to me, is an activity performed by a person or people who we call translators, involving 2 or more languages, beginning in 99.9% of cases with something we could call a source text, ending in all cases with something that we shall certainly call a target text, with some form of crossing over between languages and cultures, depending on your metaphor of what translation is. Very often we're talking about, of course, religious texts, we're talking about literary texts, we're talking about philosophical texts, and a whole bunch of other types of texts which were all subjected to this process of translation. The result was available in book form, in leaflet form, in pamphlet form, in article form, published in whatever type of publication was available, journal, article, etc. We also had the important phenomenon of retranslation, where some work which we gave importance to was subjected to 1, 3, 10, 50, or more than 100 retranslations which were published for, of course, a variety of reasons, including, incidentally, economic reasons. Now, in that very short and idealistic portrayal of what translation was, there is one important thing, I think, to underline, which is from the point of view of the mass readership, the general public. Translation was never something particularly problematic. One went and one bought translations and one accepted them for what they were, and for very many people a translation simply was the original. Now, if I move to today, the situation has become, I think, far less clear. In actual fact, much more difficult. It's true that today a translation may indeed be the work of a translator or of translators. These translators will probably use various types of software, be it translation memories, machine translation, translation tools, in order to produce the translation. It may also be the work of a person or people who believe they are translators, without actually being translators, of course. Or it may be the work of a person or people who sell themselves as translators, because in translation it's always, of course, possible to make a little bit of money. Slightly more worrying today is the fact that many translations that we see, I'm thinking particularly, of course, of the internet, are not the work of persons, but they are the work of machines, of programs, which produce things which, for the moment, I'm going to call translations, and whose relationship with the source text is, to put it mildly, very often problematic. We also have other activities. For example, we have fan subbing, and we have crowd-sourced translation, collaborative translation, where I think it would be safe to say that the professional translator no longer really has a role to play, or is no longer asked to play a role, because fan subbing is the work of amateurs who are keen on putting subtitles to mangas or whatever it is they wish to see in the other language. Collaborative translation goes out there onto internet. One doesn't even know who does it. It's also interesting to note that many originals today are, of course, no longer originals. They're not originals because they have been co-authored perhaps by people from the same linguistic background, perhaps by people from a whole variety of different linguistic backgrounds. We also have today a very curious phenomenon, which is lingua franca translation. Now, lingua franca translation happens in 2 different ways. It happens, first of all, as a source text. So a source text has been written by a person who does not really master the particular language in which he or she is writing, but writes a text nonetheless, which then has to be understood and translated. Or lingua franca lingua franca, can't even say it, lingua franca translation happens by people who translate into their B, C or Z language, which they don't necessarily manage particularly well. Now, another interesting phenomenon, of course, related to this is that we have today a proliferation of names to perhaps cover this rather extraordinary state of affairs. I'm going to read a little list. This, in actual fact, here I'm quoting Yves Gambier in an article he wrote in 2013. So this is Gambier's list. We've got localization, we've got editing, trans-editing, trans-creation, revision, adaptation, multilingual technical writing, joint authoring, language mediation, and I'm sure Yves Gambier left out one or two because people are very, very inventive when it comes to finding a label in order to say that what you do is not translation. This, by the way, is particularly the case in press agencies where the people who work there do indeed translate, but they will never actually answer to the fact that they translate. Final point in this first section is, of course, the increasing economic pressures under which translators of all types work. This makes life very hard because the conditions for translating were very often not very good, and today, for many people, they are quite simply execrable. So what do we have today when we say the word translation? I'm going to quote here Della Bastita, who calls translation a blurred and elusive concept. So I think we've moved already from the quotation by Venuti, this was 1995, by the way, that seems an awfully long time ago now, where we're talking about something that happens because perhaps humans are behind it, or perhaps humans are looking at it afterwards, or something that happens because somebody has clicked somewhere on a screen and gets a result which is called a translation. Moving now to my second theme, translation studies today. This is a very difficult theme. Often when I read, let's say, current research in the field, I read extraordinarily optimistic pronouncements on translation studies today. I read, it is exciting, it is marvelous. Translation studies is going through a series of turns, and these are marvelous turns because more and more fields are being brought into the continually expanding hyperfield of translation studies. And of course it's true, because today, for example, let's take cognitive linguistics. Cognitive linguistics is, of course, one very interesting field of translation studies, obviously. However, I am going to paint a slightly less flattering portrait of translation studies today. And I'm going to do that because I think it will have import for translation studies tomorrow. Now, to paint this not very flattering portrait, I'm going to take simply 4 characteristics of translation studies as I see it today. The first is that translation studies does not export very well. It imports very well, yes. We are very good at going and picking out nuggets left, right, and center. We're very good at borrowing concepts, and we're very good at turning. However, how much is our academic work, how much is our problematics, are they exported into other fields? I won't say there is nothing, but let's say there is a fundamental imbalance that is happening there. The second characteristic I'd like to draw your attention to is one I'm going to speak very briefly about because I believe that Annie Brisset is going to address this question this afternoon. And this is the fact that despite the fact that we deal with translation, and translation by definition is all about crossing borders, translation studies does not always seem to cross borders very well. What I mean by this, of course, is that we have, for example, in the Francophone world, something called traductologie. I'm not even sure if by saying in the Francophone world it actually means very much, because I'm not actually sure that what happens in Canada is entirely comparable with what happens in France, which is entirely comparable with what happens in Switzerland, Belgium, or in other countries which practice Francophone translation studies. And I'm thinking here, for example, of Romania. What is the result of this? We have kind of a series of simultaneous discourses on the subject of translation and a little bit of deafness at the same time, where it seems very hard often for people to understand when they're within a certain, let's say, cultural and linguistic move of what they hear in translation. It's very hard for them to know what it is that's actually happening over those borders. My third characteristic is that translation studies does not translate very well, and I'm thinking here, of course, about the writings in translation studies. There is almost a kind of anarchy that goes on here. Some things are indeed translated, many things are not translated. Now, when you look at it, I find it very curious when you look at the fate of certain, what for me are important works, which simply are not translated. Jean-Yves Masson talked about Katharina Reiss and her very important book on translation criticism published in 1971. Why is it that it took 30 years for this book to appear in French and in English? That's a very long time. If you look at Vinet d'Arbonnet, you know their famous book of 58, talking about translation procedures. How does one explain that it took almost 40 years for that book to appear in English? And in fact, why was it translated 40 years later? Is this the first book in the series of the history of translation studies? Because obviously in 40 years things have moved on, so I don't believe it was translated perhaps as a book to be used either in theoretical or in practical ways. If you look at Levy's book, The Art of Translation, which appeared in Czech, I think, in about 1963, why did it take almost 50 years for that book to appear in English? Now, it did actually appear in German in 1969, fair enough. Appeared in German and then more or less disappeared from the scene. And then almost 50 years later, it appears in English. Now, this to me is an extremely important book. And I personally feel deprived of the fact that I was not able to read that book before. I wasn't even aware that it existed in German. My fault. When you take different languages, the situation is again very confusing, because certain works in English do indeed get translated. It's gone again, hasn't it? Do indeed get translated into Italian, perhaps slightly less into French, much less into Spanish, much less into French. In my faculty, where we have 6 mother tongues, the students say to me, well, why can't I read this work in my language? Why is it not there? And for example, in Geneva, in Switzerland, where already we have 3 official languages, 4 national languages, 3 official languages, we indeed have students who do not read English. And so they do not get to read a whole swathe of important works because those works have not been translated into the languages that they have. That was my third characteristic, and that, I think, is interesting and indicative and important, but it is nothing when compared to my fourth characteristic, which is where I start to get worried. Now, the fourth characteristic is what I would call the hidden turn in translation studies. And to make it quite clear what I'm talking about straight away, to me, the hidden turn in translation studies is quite simply the Anglo turn in translation studies. It is the Anglo turn. It is the fact that more and more specialists feel obliged to write in English. You can see why I started thinking about my speech in French some time ago, because I wanted to say all this in French, and I've been deprived of that honour. There we go. It's a little bit absurd, of course, that we are talking about the activity of translation and we're talking more and more about it in one language, and we're conceptualizing in one language. What does this mean? It means that writing in the field is becoming asepticized. It follows the constraint of one model. We write following the Anglo-Saxon model, the Anglo-Saxon way of thinking. What does this mean as well? It means that we are erasing the academic traditions. We are erasing the histories of those other languages. We are no longer relying on those resources which we would normally rely upon. It means as well that the concepts that we use are those concepts which are currently peddled in English. Now, if I can take just a very banal example of this, the idea of domestication and foreignization, which I'm sure you all know about because it does appear in so many languages now. This, as everybody knows, is Venuti. Venuti went and read translations of Schleiermacher and decided to adapt that for his American public. That's fine. Nobody's got any objections to that, of course. But how come that now people writing in French will refer to these concepts, which they will very beautifully translate, for example, as étrangérisation? Why not? I don't have an objection to that, but what I do have an objection to is the fact that this simply erases the thinking that has happened in the French language on this very subject. It erases, for example, Méchonic's whole ideas about annexing and decentering, which are absolutely extraordinary ideas because they are simultaneously theoretical and, of course, practical. It erases Berman's idea, where you talk about either an ethnocentric translation or an ethical translation. It erases l'Admiral, who talks about Sorcier and Siblis. And l'Admiral is, of course, positioning himself from the point of view of the translator. It even erases, alas, my own tiny little contribution where I talk about Sourcis and Ciblier, but that's beside the point. That was really more also to make Jean-René laugh at the time. Now, there is one extremely serious consequence of this, and that is the way in which people who write in English refer in a vast majority, to other people who write in English. So what we have here is a kind of vicious circle. We have people who either write in English because they normally do or who feel they must write in English. And when they write in English, they refer to other people who write in English. So do you see the paradox here? The paradox here is that while translation studies is apparently expanding and becoming a polydiscipline, at the same time it is shrinking. It is shrinking because we are cutting out all those other traditions and all those other writings. Now, just to verify this, this hypothesis, I went and looked in two places. I had a look through the Benjamin's Handbook of Translation Studies, which incidentally is a handbook which is going through the motions of translating the articles into a whole range of different languages, so this is marvelous. I looked at the article called Translation Studies, and I thought, well, I'm going to look at the German translation. And there, clicking on the German translation, I discovered that the German text does not talk about Übersetzungswissenschaft, but it translates translation studies as translation studies. So translation studies as a concept has now become English. Slightly more worrying is that in the references given at the bottom of all the articles, 85% of those references are references to books and articles in English. Slightly worse, I looked at Monday's Introduction to Translation Studies, and there it is not 85% of the references to translation studies that are in English, it is 91%. So 91% of those references to translation studies are references in English. Of the remaining 9, half are in actual fact references to books and articles that have been translated into English, and only half of that, so only 4.5%, are references to works that have not been translated into English. I think it's a serious situation, and I'm not sure I've got an answer to this, and I shall return very briefly to this in my conclusion. So to summarize so far before moving towards the future, translation today is a blurred and fuzzy concept, rather beyond our control. Translation studies is simultaneously expanding and shrinking as it cuts out other non-Anglo traditions, and it also remains partially cut off from what is actually happening out there in the real world of translation. I'm now in my third part, and I'm talking about translation today. Translators today have, of course, lost their monopoly. They've lost their monopoly because, as I said previously, anyone can click on a screen on a computer program and get a translation. I always used to put inverted commas on the word translation when I used it in that way, but it is wrong to do so, I think, today. Why? It's wrong to do so because, looked at from a certain point of view, statistical machine translation and now neural machine translation is getting exponentially better. That is a fact. Google Translate published a figure almost a year ago saying that they estimate that 500 million people use their translation service. It's an interesting figure. I'm going to be talking about three reasons why machine translation, statistical machine translation, is set to grow. The first is obvious: it is extremely quick. The second is also obvious: it is apparently cheap. And I say, of course, apparently, for the reasons you can probably guess. The third is more worrying: it is or will shortly become plausible. And my key idea here is, of course, what is plausible? Now, today we have post-editors. Post-editors are those people who are employed when we have an honest publisher, an honest person who wishes to publish a translation, who knows very well that statistical machine translation makes lots of mistakes, and that you need someone who is there to correct those mistakes. I was talking to a specialist just a few days ago, and he explained to me, for example, that in the field of medical translation, where statistical machine translation is used a lot, there is still a major problem with negation. And I said to him, fine, but with what languages? He said, with English and French, for example. Now, you can foresee the problems if you're reading a text, if the text says, cut off the leg, or do not cut off the leg. It makes a difference, depending, I suppose, on the part of the body, but even so. That's something one wants to get right. So today we do have post-editors. Now, post-editors may be translators. Post-editors may be people who are actually interested in the interpretation of the text. So there may be some hope there. But perhaps some post-editors are more linguistic editors rather than content editors. And that is going to prove problematical. Incidentally, this type of translation works very well for something called indicative translation. I'm quoting here from Alan Melby, indicative translation is where you don't need to know the fine details, you just need to know the general gist. That would apparently work quite well. But, of course, the dividing line between indicative translation and quality translation is, to put it mildly, a rather fuzzy one. Now, I'm actually going to not talk about all that. I'm going to talk about literary translation, because that, to me, is what matters, or at least everything matters, of course, but it matters particularly. And I'm going to talk about it because for many years, people, myself included, have simply rubbished the idea that a machine could ever one day actually translate literature. I'm just going to quote David Bellos writing 6 years ago. He said, "For works that are truly original and therefore worth translating, statistical machine translation hasn't got a hope." Now, I loved reading that. I love hearing that when people say it, and I too have sniggered when putting a literary text into a translation program and seeing the result. However, I had a rather sobering experience just 2 weeks ago, where I decided to put into Google Translate the beginning of a novel written by Éric Orsena called L'Exposition coloniale. And the result made me feel rather afraid. And I'm going to quote to you not the original, but I'm going to read the translation. It's very short. "In the beginning was the bookshop. I'm talking about a time when books were still important, a fairly remote period of our history, separated from us by 2 world conflicts, some attempts at genocide, the discouraging erection of the Eiffel Tower, and other less important events." This is an extremely worrying translation because it is plausible. It is plausible, and when a translation is plausible, who is going to go and check? It's plausible because it's linguistically plausible. Now, it is not actually plausible in terms of interpretation, because there are actually 2 things which, in my interpretation, are quite simply wrong. But unless you go and look, you can't see it. And this, to me, is the major problem that we are going to have to confront in the years to come. So what if I move forward X years in time, and I don't know how many years it is? There I am with my Kindle or my iBooks or whatever it is, and I decide I want to read Tolstoy's War and Peace in French. What do? I click, I pay an extremely small sum of money, and what do I get? I get the most, not even the most recent, I get the instantaneous machine translation of War and Peace. It's not yesterday's translation, and it's not the translation from the day before. It is the one that the machine has produced now, which the machine has produced now because now it's the corpora on which it works have got 1 million times bigger. It has fed in all the different comments that it's received on the other translations. And so, in a sense, translation as such has disappeared because we are constantly in the process of producing new translations and new translations. It's a little bit of a nightmare, and of course we're a long way from being there yet. But researchers are working on it, and they're working on it from the point of view even of translation studies as we know it. If I can quote from an article written by Torrell and Way called Machine-Assisted Translation of Literary Text, they say, I quote, "Machine translation has the potential to be useful for literary translators." And they say, of course, that this will help them to make money. Now, of course, they've got a point, and everybody knows that 90% of literary translators don't make money, and they have other jobs, of course. But the point is that we are gradually moving towards a period of increasing plausibility. And once again, it is linguistic plausibility. So I'm going to return to this fact just one little bit later when I reach my conclusion. Translation studies tomorrow. I'm in my fourth and final part, and I'm going to paint the black scenario in order, of course, to rubbish it in my turn. The black scenario is that machines do the job so well that we're no longer necessary. If that were ever to happen, most of what we talk about today would simply become irrelevant. I went through a list of interesting topics in translation studies. I started at the letter C, and I came across cognitive approaches, irrelevant, collaborative translation, irrelevant, competence, irrelevant, creativity, irrelevant, equivalence, irrelevant, etc., etc. You see my point. My point is that if that were to happen, we would have to rethink things in a fairly dramatic way. It reminds me of what happened in Germany after 1989, incidentally, when people were sent into what had been East Germany to talk to teachers of political philosophy, where they explained that those people teaching Marxism, Leninism, were in actual fact out of a job, put very nicely. So my fear would be that in X years' time, we will receive someone will come and knock on our door and say, well, you teach that thing called translation studies. Quite frankly, you can pack up and go home. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, and I don't think that's going to happen for two major reasons. The first of those reasons has, in actual fact, already been explained by Jean-Yves Masson, so I don't need to go over some of the ground that he covered and explain to us, as we all know, the importance of history of translation, the translation of history, the history of literary translation, etc., etc. There is so much work to do there. There is so much work to do on retranslation that I think that, in a sense, we don't need to worry. However, I do believe that we need to go through a kind of reorientation in some of the research we do in order to account for this new paradigm. So I'm just going to outline one or two of the things which I think that we need to look at. I think we need to look at needs in today's world, translation needs, and in particular about this fine line between indicative translation and quality translation. We certainly need to do more work on the players involved in the translation operation. What does it mean to have multiple players? Does the direction of translation matter? How important is the linguistic, the cultural, the socio-cultural identity of the players? How have translation markets changed with, of course, all these new innovations which have arisen? We need to look much more closely at the economics of translation. There needs to be, as Yves Gambier has said, an economic turn in translation studies, and we need to compare translation and non-translation. And above all, we need to look at the consequences of non-interpretation, which is the case of machine translation. We need to look at what it means to have translations that are based on predictability and therefore plausibility rather than on interpretation. So what does it entail when much translation is either machine translation or machine and post-edited? When does it suffice? When can it suffice? And particularly when and why does it not suffice? I think you can see the results of the three parameters I outlined. If it's quick, everyone's going to want to do it. If it's cheap, nobody is going to want to pay for real translation. And if it's plausible, we are in trouble because we need to be able to check that out. I'm going to come to my conclusion now. So in my first two parts, I tried to look at the state of play in translation. I tried to look at the state of play in translation studies, though perhaps from a very slightly jaundiced point of view. And in my parts 3 and 4, I have attempted to project towards the future. I'm going to conclude just by briefly going through my two definitions. Venuti, you remember, talked about a translator who translates on the strength of an interpretation. Now, Today, do we still have translators? Of course we do, and do those translators work on the strength of an interpretation? Of course they do as well, but we need to not only maintain that, but we need to do more research into why that is so vital. Monday's definition talked about phenomena associated with translation in its many forms. And that, of course, is a very clever definition because it enables us to talk about translation such as it is today. That is good. But what it does not help us with is this problem that I outlined very briefly, which is the Anglo turn in translation studies. Now, how can one be anything but pessimistic about that? It's very hard. That said, the future of translation studies is necessarily in our hands. It's up to us to do something if we wish to do something. It's up to us to translate what translation specialists have written to make it available to other people. And it's up to us to ensure that writings do happen in other languages. Now, that sounds like maybe a call to action, and I hope it is a call to action. That's what I hope we will even be doing within the next 5 days at this Congress. Thank you very much.